want us to remember.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. History, like most scholarly pursuits in academia, is dominated by the banal and the trivial. The mantra of disinterested scholarship and the obsession with data collection add up, as the historian Howard Zinn wrote, to the fear that using our intelligence to further our moral ends is somehow improper. Academics are rewarded for buttressing the ruling social structure, producing heavy tomes on the ruling elites, and ignoring the underlying social forces that have been the true engines of social and political change in the United States. Most academics are complicit in masking the inconvenient facts that tarnish the myth. Facts about genocide, slavery, class, repression, racism, and the lies told by the ruling elites, the mass media, and powerful institutions to justify power. Historians who are apologists for the past are rewarded and promoted. Truth tellers are often marginalized. This struggle to discern the truth of our past is being played out with the popular revolt against Confederate monuments. I'm joined today by Professor Eric Foner, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and DeWitt Clinton, Professor of History at Columbia University. He is one of the country's foremost scholars of American history. From his first book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, The Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War, to his books on Reconstruction and Slavery, Tom Paine, and the Underground Railroad, he has shattered the myths we tell ourselves about ourselves to shine a fierce and uncompromising light on our nation's past, a past that informs our present. His latest book is Battles for Freedom, the Use and Abuse of American History. Thank you. And I should add, not only are you a brilliant historian, but you can write, which makes me wonder how you ever got into academia.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
When I worked as a reporter at the New York Times, we used to say that we manipulated facts. They were facts. They were verifiable facts, but we could spin them any way we wanted to. And I think when I read your stuff that you would agree that that's also true about historians.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. I mean, we're not novelists. We do not invent facts. We don't invent dialogue from the past. We leave that to the novelists, who sometimes do a very good job of it. But one of the things a lot of people don't quite understand about the writing of history is history is the creation of the historian. In other words, the narrative is a product of your imagination. How you put the facts together, how you choose what is a fact. And so for almost any important subject in American history, or any history, there are many different interpretations out there, and there's nothing unusual about that. People have preconceptions, they have different ideas of what's important, and they gear the history to their own interests and to the interests of their own time that they're writing in, and as a result, you come up with a lot of different histories, which is partly what makes it interesting to study.
You make a couple points. One is that any writing of history is grounded in the moment, is
Right.
responding to the contemporary moment. But also, you talk about what we might call the lie of omission, what Nietzsche calls creative forgetfulness, that amnesia, I mean, you say at one point that amnesia best describes America's official stance regarding slavery, but it is what we omit that so much shapes our perception of ourselves, and we're watching that now with the whole turmoil around Confederate monuments in the South.
Right. Carl Becker, the historian, wrote, that history is what the present chooses to remember. And then you choose to forget things too. So yes, when I was in high school, I got in my history textbooks a story of American history, which was very one-dimensional. It was all about the rise of freedom and liberty and all this kind of thing. Slavery was omitted almost entirely. The general plight of African Americans and other non-whites were pretty much omitted from this story. So it was very partial. It was very limited. And that's the same thing with all these statues and the debate you just mentioned. I'm not one of those that says tear down every single statue of every Confederate all over the place. But if you step back and look at the public presentation of history, particularly in the South, through these monuments and things, where are the black people of the South?
Well, where are the monuments to lynching?
Right. Where's the monument to slavery to begin with,
yeah.
to the victims of slavery? The monument to the victims of lynching? The monument to the black leaders of Reconstruction, the first black senators and members of Congress? My view is, as well as taking down some statues, I think we need to put up others. If we want to have a public commemoration of history, it ought to be diverse enough to include the whole history, not just the history that those in power want us to remember.
You write in the book about how this creates a kind of, you quote Lowen, a landscape of denial. What do you mean by that?
Well, James Lowen, very good historian, wrote a book called Lies Across America, which is exactly about monuments and the lack of monuments, and those that exist, what they say. For example, there was a monument that was now taken down. It's sort of in limbo in New Orleans, to the White League, which during Reconstruction was a racist organization which had an uprising
trying to paramilitary.
Yeah, try to overthrow the biracial government of Louisiana. And there was a monument to the Battle of Liberty Place, and the marker on it said, you know, they tried to give us back our state. Well, who is the us? It's the white Louisianans who could not come to terms with the fact that black people were exercising significant political power at the time. So that's a very warped, that's a denial of the actual history of the period. And there are many, many monuments that suffer from that, as Lowen and others have been pointing out.
In the book, you write about an exhibit about the West in the Smithsonian.
Right.
So it's coupled with this landscape of denial, this historical amnesia, is a deification of, in this case, westward expansion that is a lie.
Well, you know, as you well know, a mythology of the West is deeply rooted in our culture, whether it's in Western movies, you know, of which there are a gazillion of them, or the idea of the lone pioneer, you know, and the individual, you know, roughing it out in the West. And of course, the main lie there is that the West was kind of empty before white settlers and hunters and trappers and others, farmers, came from the East to settle it. In fact, the West has been populated forever, and the real story of the West is the clash of all these different peoples, Native Americans, Asians in California, settlers coming in from the East, Mexicans. The West is a very multicultural place. There are a lot of histories there, but many of those histories are kind of ignored or subordinated in this one story of the westward movement.
Well, you go back and look at the particular worldview of the artists, in this case, who are perpetuating that vision of the West, and they are rabidly racist.
Yeah, that exhibit at the Smithsonian was actually meant to deconstruct, so to speak, the mythology and to present...
For which it was attacked.
Oh, and that's the point. I wrote about the controversy, and many people don't want to hear it. They don't want their mythology to be taken apart or complicated. And so there was a lot of criticism of the Smithsonian for challenging the more traditional view of Western history. The West is a multiracial place, and racism is certainly part of Western history, but you're not going to get that from a John Wayne movie. You're not going to get that from many of the Frederick Remington.
You got to read Richard Slotkin.
Yeah, right, the paintings by Remington and others.
Right.
You're not going to get that aspect of Western history. So, but the problem is really not simply, oh, well, this is not accurate or it's inadequate. It's that that's a history which doesn't help you understand the present.
It's not true. It's a myth.
Right, but in a way, that's not even the worst thing about it. The worst thing is that if you adhere to that myth, you can't understand the present. History is supposed to give you insight into the present, and that history could not have produced the present.
So we're enveloped now in a country that has confused myth with history, which means they can't understand the present.
Well, I think in some ways our understanding of history has gotten a little more sophisticated over my 50 years of teaching.
Well, it has at places like Columbia.
Well, and in high schools, textbooks, but you're right.
But you write about the rewriting of textbooks in Texas.
Yeah, well, Texas is a funny place, as you well know. Let's leave them out in their own little corner. Yes, Texas has this school commission which vets the textbooks who get used in high school in Texas, and unless they adhere to the ideology of that commission, you're not going to get into the Texas market.
Which is called white supremacy.
Well, it's pro-Confederate. It's not only white supremacy. It's it's current republicanism, limited government, deregulation, that sort of thing, and definitely has a strong white supremacist element to it. But the Texas market is gigantic. I mean, you know, where was...
Well, but the problem with Texas is that so many other states, because it's gigantic,
right,
use those textbooks.
Well, that's the problem, because a publisher is not going to say, all right, we're printing these books for Texas, but then we're going to print other books for other states. They don't do that. They got a textbook. If they have to modify it for Texas, that'll be the way the textbook is. So I think that is a problem.
I mean, wouldn't you say that, I mean, look at with the rise of Donald Trump, I mean, isn't this based on a complete fantasy of America, who we are, where we came, isn't it?
Well, Trump certainly, as we have seen in the past few weeks, appeals directly to those who have a particular view of what you might call a white supremacist view of America, of American history. I wrote a little piece in the New York Times questioning when he talked about our history.
Right.
That taking down statues is, is ruining our history. Well, who are the our? Who is that our? It's a very limited group. It's white people, particularly. It's pro-Confederate people. I'm not claiming that Trump is a neo-Nazi. I mean, frankly, he doesn't even have enough political ideas to be called a neo-Nazi. But his general, approach is to appeal to those elements of his base who are the most retrograde. And so, yes, it does come with a view of American history.
And that goes back to what you call the cult of the lost cause about the Civil War,
right,
which becomes vital to how these people perceive America. Perhaps you can talk about that.
Well, the lost cause was, an idea developed mostly in the 1890s and then a little bit after that, which glorified the Confederacy, romanticized slavery, and basically tried to write slavery out of the history of the Civil War.
Well, even to the point where you write that they will claim that there were blacks fighting. I mean, because, of course, figures like Nathan Bedford Forrest took his slaves with him.
There were no blacks fighting for the Confederacy, right, but unfortunately, if you go on the internet today, you can find websites devoted to the blacks fighting in the Confederacy. But this is a myth. There were certainly blacks working in the army camps. Every army, as you well know, has all sorts of civilian people working for it, whether it's teamsters or laundresses or construction workers or many, many other things. And some people did bring their slaves along, and the government impressed slaves to work for them. But these are not soldiers. These are not combat troops. The number, at the very end of the war, like the last month, the Confederacy began putting a handful of black soldiers into the army around Richmond, just before it fell, but around Petersburg. But yeah, there's this mythology of the Confederacy as a kind of multicultural paradise.
Well, it becomes a way to deny that it was about slavery, that it was about the protection of slavery.
This is a myth, but unfortunately, like many things on the internet, you can find it, even though it is a myth. It's out there, and there are people who are propagating it.
All right. When we come back, we'll hear more from Professor Eric Foner. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. Let's get back to our conversation with Professor Eric Foner, author of Battles for Freedom, the Use and Abuse of American History. I want to talk about the nature of what it means to write history. And you quote Nietzsche saying that there are three approaches to the writing of history: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical.
Right. Well, the monumental is the history that glorifies basically the nation state, that is represented in monuments that do not question anything about the society. And a lot of history is like that. A lot of, the rise of history as a discipline coincided with the rise of the nation state. And every nation needs a kind of set of myths to justify its own existence. That's why another of my favorite writers, Ernest Renan, the French historian, wrote long ago, the historian is the enemy of the nation. He doesn't mean that they're spies or anything. The historian comes along and takes apart the mythologies that are helping to underpin the legitimacy of the nation. So monumental.
Well, a good historian.
Right, but that's why people don't like them very often. They don't want to hear these things. Okay, antiquarian is what a lot of people are, and that's fine. They're looking for their personal roots. They're looking for their family history. They're going on Ancestry.com to find out where their DNA came from. That's not really history exactly. They don't really have much of a historical context, but it stimulates people to think about the past. And then there's what Nietzsche called critical history, or he also said the history that judges and condemns. In other words, it takes a moral stance. It doesn't just relate the facts, it tells you what is good and what is evil. And a lot of historians don't quite like to do that, but to me it's important. It's important for the historian, having done the research, having presented the history, to say, all right, look, here's where I stand in relation to all these important issues of our history.
And you're writing this about Howard Zinn.
I wrote it about Zinn because certainly he was an example of what Nietzsche called critical history. His People's History of the United States, has sold, 2 million copies or more. Very influential book. There are things wrong with that book, as there are with almost any book, but what I found as a teacher is I've had many students, good students, whose interest in history was stimulated by Howard Zinn.
Well, I think I told you, I taught it in a prison. And he is very cognizant of the African-American experience from the beginning.
Right.
When Washington throws African-American soldiers out of the Continental Army. And it electrified my students.
Well, it opens their eyes. They say, wait a minute, this is not what I was taught in high school. I'm talking about college students here. This is not what I've heard. This is a different view of American history.
But it's our story. It's not the story of the powerful.
And it gets people interested to go and do more reading and do more research. And, Howard was, I knew him reasonably well. He was a courageous guy. He was a very, friendly and just open-minded guy. And nobody could accuse Howard Zinn of being like a foreign agent. I mean, he was an air pilot in World War II. He's a middle American guy. This guy was a homegrown American. He was not some foreign ideology infiltrating into the United States.
Well, I think you write an essay in there about Bernie Sanders saying, let's, instead of talking about Denmark,
right.
Let's talk about Debs.
Yeah, Bernie, this came during the campaign when Bernie was trying to get the Democratic nomination in 2016. And someone asked him, what do you mean by democratic socialism? He said, well, we should be like Denmark. And I just said, Bernie, that's not, no, most people in the United States don't know anything about Denmark and don't really care that much about Denmark. And more to the point, as you said, there is an indigenous American radical tradition that we ought to be identifying with, whether it's Frederick Douglass, Eugene Debs, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., those are the people who are trying to make America a better place, and that's the tradition you're in.
And those figures become sanitized. King, you talk about Helen Keller, a committed socialist.
Right. No, King was a very radical guy. Yeah. And yet every, January, we always see is King up at the Lincoln Memorial.
Well, he's frozen in 1963.
He's frozen with one speech, even one sentence.
Yeah.
I want my children to be judged, by the content of their character, not just the color of their skin. That's not what the whole civil rights movement was about. The King, people forget, he died leading a poor people's march, leading a strike of sanitation workers. He wasn't just out there talking about civil rights. He had moved to economic equality as the fundamental issue, and Bernie picked that up, and Bernie should be saying, hey, I am following in a great American tradition here.
You make a point in the book that I thought was very interesting, and you talk about the practical politicians as opposed to the utopian social reformers, and in particular, the abolitionists, who you said their first task was to destroy the conspiracy of silence by which political parties, churches, and other institutions sought to exclude slavery from public debate. And then you go on and you say, for most of the 1850s, the first 2 years of the Civil War, Lincoln, widely considered the model of a pragmatic politician, advocated a series of plans to end slavery, gradual emancipation, monetary compensation, setting up colonies to send black African Americans out of the country to settle. You call these a harebrained scheme that had no possibility of enactment. It was the abolitionists, still viewed by some historians as irresponsible fanatics, who put forward the program in immediate and uncompensated end to slavery, with black people becoming U.S. citizens, that came to pass.
Yeah, that's pretty good writing. That's exactly right. I mean, I've written a lot about Lincoln. That's my time period, the Civil War, Reconstruction. And yes, there's a whole Lincoln industry out there. I have contributed to it, which sees Lincoln as the absolute model of the practical politician. But in fact, Lincoln's ideas were not practical at all. What was great about Lincoln was he was able to change. When Lincoln saw that his ideas were not working, he moved to other ideas. He wasn't stubborn. He wasn't stuck in his ways. He was not too prideful to say, I was wrong, The abolitionists, who are generally considered absolutely fanatical impracticals, their policy came to me. So that is, Max Weber I quote somewhere in there, you know, what is possible would never have been possible if other people had not asked for the impossible. So it's this symbiotic connection between radical demand and practical implementation that I think we need to try to look for.
What you studied with Hofstadter, and he said American history was characterized by broad agreement on fundamentals, particularly the virtues of individual liberty, private property, and capitalist enterprise, arguing in essence that the divisions that historians write about in American history are minor.
Well, he was associated very closely with what they called the consensus school, which argued that there was an overriding consensus. Yes, Democrats versus Whigs, Republicans versus Democrats. It's all kind of a family quarrel without any genuine, serious disagreements. And the other side of that coin is the people who did have serious disagreements are kind of fanatics. They're outside the mainstream, or a phrase he used that became very prominent lately, the paranoid style. They're psychologically deranged in some way. And, you know, so that the people in consensus are normal and stable, and the people criticizing from the outside are paranoid and irresponsible. Now, Hofstadter himself began to move away from that in the 1960s when he saw the society falling apart and all of this turmoil, and the consensus vision could not explain this. If there's no disagreement in America, why are hundreds of thousands of people in the street every weekend? So Hofstadter moved beyond that, but nonetheless, that consensus view certainly did have a strong hold on American history.
Well, it does now, doesn't it? Through, I mean, you talk about neoliberalism. I think you call it a zombie. You know that
it's dead but still walks the earth.
Dead but still walking. But that is our consensus.
Well, after all, who was it? Fukuyama, right? Who said that we've reached the end of history. In other words, there's nothing more to debate. There's no more disagreement about what the best form of society is. From the late 80s maybe until 2008, that was it. Neoliberalism. Democrat, Republican didn't matter. Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, they were all neoliberals.
And that was true, I think Hofstadter's writing about early American history, which was this Lockean deification of private property.
Right, but then you get to how do you explain the Civil War within a consensus point of view? The only way to do that is what some historians do say, well, it was all a big mistake, you know, the blundering generation, the needless war. It takes the fundamental issue of slavery sort of out of the narrative. But yeah, there was this neoliberal consensus. It was shattered by 2008. The neoliberalism failed abysmally, and we're still living in that wreckage. It's, as I said, it's a zombie movement now because it's dead but still alive. But nonetheless, nothing really viable has come to take its place.
It's Gramsci. I mean, you know, we're this moment of morbidity. I want to read a quote by Zinn. The search for a non-existent objectivity has led us, ironically, into a particularly retrogressive subjectivity, that of the bystander, which he condemns. And I think you do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the historian... Objectivity is an interesting and often misunderstood word. I tell my students what objectivity means is you have an open mind, not an empty mind. There is no person who doesn't have preconceptions, values, assumptions, and you bring those to the study of history. What it means to be objective is if you begin encountering evidence, research that questions some of your assumptions, you may have to change your mind. You have to have an open mind in your encounters with the evidence. But that doesn't mean you don't take a stand. Right, the stance of the bystander is not the right thing. You have an obligation. If you have done all this study, if you've done all this research, if you understand key issues in American history better than most people just because you've done the research and they haven't, you have an obligation as a citizen to speak up about it and to say, okay, I have studied all this, here's my conclusion. That doesn't mean everyone has to say, oh, you're right, I'm not going to think for myself. But we should not be bystanders. We should be active citizens. Being a historian and being an active citizen is not mutually contradictory.
Well, and that is what makes you such a great historian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Eric Foner, author of Battles for Freedom, The Use and Abuse of American History. Culture and literacy in our final stage of decline have been replaced with noisy diversions and empty cliches. The Roman statesman Cicero inveighed against their ancient equivalent, the arena. Cicero, for his honesty, was hunted down and murdered, his severed head and his right hand nailed onto the speaker's platform in the Forum. The roaring crowds were gleefully told he would never speak or write again. We are infected with a toxic, mindless cacophony, our own version of spectacle and gladiator fights, of bread and circus, pumped out over the airwaves in endless cycles. Political life has fused into celebrity worship. Education is primarily vocational. Intellectuals are cast out and despised. Artists cannot make a living. Few people read books. Thought has been banished, especially at universities and colleges, where timid pedants and careerists churn out academic drivel. Although tyranny, because it needs no consent, may successfully rule over foreign peoples, Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, it can stay in power only if it destroys, first of all, the national institutions of its own people. And because ours have been destroyed, the imbecilic utterings of our degraded culture is tweeted daily in sound bites from the Oval Office. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. I'll see you next week.